Welcome everybody to our session on applying for a PhD in political science. I am Kathleen Cunningham and I am the co-director of graduate studies at the University of Maryland. And this is the second of these events that I've done. And I'm just delighted to have a number of other DGSs, as we call them, that have volunteered their time to be with us today to talk about the process of applying for a PhD and why in the world you might want to do it. So I'm going to take a quick minute here and have all of the other participants introduce themselves. And I'm just going to call on you according to how you've arrived on my screen. So Emily Ritter, would you like to introduce yourself?
I am Emily Henkin-Ritter. I'm the Director of Graduate Studies at Vanderbilt University, and I have been the DGS here for 3 years.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Paul Post.
Hi, I'm Paul Post. I'm at the University of Chicago, and I am going soon into my 4th year as DGS here in the Department of Political Science.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Michael Ackman.
Hi, everybody. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm in charge of admissions and career placement, and I've started doing this with this position about a year ago.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And Thorin Wright is here with us as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Thorin Wright. I'm the DGS in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University, and I started in January of 2020.
What an inauspicious time to start this job. I bet it's been very exciting. Well, I'm just delighted to have all of you joining us to share your wisdom about guiding PhD students, about applying to the program, and sort of what we're all doing here. I have set out a kind of a set of questions that I think are of broad interest to potential applicants, and so I'm going to sort of moderate everyone answering those questions, throw in my 2 cents where I feel like there might be one more thing to add, and then we'll also do some questions as well. So I want to go ahead and start with a question about the process of applying to a PhD program, because I know this is quite different than applying for undergraduate or even something like law school. So Thorin, I was wondering if you could start us off by talking about what that looks like.
Sure. I think the big I've got a number of steps written out, and there's several, and I'm sure I'll miss some details that other folks can fill in. But I think a good first step is identifying the programs you want to apply to. Typically, this is not as broad of an application process as some folks might do for college or for law school or something like that, for instance. I typically recommend to undergrads to try and identify somewhere between 5 and 10 schools. And that 10, I think, is kind of a lot. And I think the reason is that you shouldn't just identify programs based on something like a US News ranking. Those are useful for kind of identifying maybe the scope of schools you want to look at the broadest set, but there are schools that are ranked, say, 50th on US News ranking that have a lot of really good strengths in particular areas and might be a really good fit for you depending on your research interests. And so I don't know if those using something like a ranking system is a particularly good way to identify which programs to apply to. I think it takes a little longer, but really the question to ask yourself when you're applying for which schools you want to apply to is, who does the work that you find the most interesting? All right, whose work is it that you want to emulate when you're doing research on your own? And the easiest way to do that is to, go back to your syllabi, the work that you liked reading when you're working on your senior thesis or seminar or upper level course papers and things like that. But the most straightforward way to do this is to find your faculty members and talk to them about where you should go. They are more plugged into the kind of universe and network of graduate programs and how they operate. And so they will be able to help you there. One thing to keep in mind when designing an application is that each one usually comes with an application fee, and that can range quite a bit. I think ASU's is $70, and that can be more than that in some places. And so you want to think about how much that's going to cost. And then some places will require a GRE. Some places will not. It's probably a good idea to go on and take a GRE. ASU doesn't require one anymore. And I don't think we're going to go back to it. All of those should probably be done. So schools start their admissions process, start taking applications in the fall, usually close sometime around December 31st, January 1st, something like that. So all of this should get started probably earlier on in the fall semester. The next thing I would say is to line up letters of recommendation. And well, Kathleen notes that application fees can be waived. They can be waived in some places. They cannot be waived at ours. And so, except in very, very specific circumstances. But the next step I would say is lining up letters of recommendation and working on a personal statement. I recommend students write their personal statement first and send it to me when I write a letter of recommendation, because I'm used to doing this kind of advising, and you definitely want somebody reading over your personal statement. We're going to have a longer conversation about what a strong application looks like. And so we can talk about the personal statement in more detail. But I think to me, it's the personal statement and maybe the writing sample are the two most important parts of an application. Letters of recommendation should be lined up at least a month in advance. Just as a general rule of thumb, faculty tend to forget and need to be reminded about things quite a bit. And so the further ahead of time, the better. After that, the process is sort of done for the student, and then it gets turned over to the schools you applied to. So our close date is somewhere around January 1st. You know, the semester doesn't start for another 2 weeks, roughly. And so that's when the graduate admissions committee starts to meet sometime in the second or third week of January, sometimes a little later. And they start making decisions on folks to make offers to. Some graduate programs will only make admissions offers to students they can fund as well. Some will make admissions offers with funding. Some will make admissions offers without funding. Here at ASU, we only admit students that we can fund. And that's a very small number. We usually make, we have very small cohorts, somewhere around 5 to 7 every year. We may make 10 offers and expecting only 5 to 7 to say yes. And then there's a wait list. And so sometimes you'll get information that you're waitlisted in February, and you may not find out that you're not waitlisted anymore until April because of the way the process is going to happen. And then the rest of that process is visit, recruitment, a lot of communication with grad directors, with graduate committee members, and folks like that. So, and we can talk more about what goes into a visit, what kind of questions to ask, but that I think is the big overview of the process as a whole. I think I covered most of the bases, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Lauren. And I do see some comments coming in, and I'm going to compile those moving forward. So I'm not ignoring your questions as they come in. Why don't we switch over here to Emily, who is going to talk about for a few minutes what makes a strong application. So focusing on some of these same elements as you turn in your application file, which is, as Thorne mentioned, it's going to be your statement, your letters of recommendation, your writing sample, maybe test scores. And at that next stage, as Thorne mentioned, you have a committee typically of faculty that are reading somewhere between 50 and 200 of these. So Emily's going to give us some advice here on how to have the strongest application that you can.
Thanks, Kathleen. I just want to reiterate, I want to build on what Thorin said, which is that the GRE is now optional for our program, and we're expecting to eliminate it entirely. So it doesn't hurt to reach out to the programs you're going to apply to and ask if they are requiring the GRE. I get those emails all the time and have no problem answering them. So, and we do waive application fees if you can show financial hardship. So it doesn't ever hurt to reach out. I get those emails all the time. As far as what goes into a really successful application, I think that for me, the statement of purpose is the most important piece, because we receive over 200 applications every year, and so most of them have really good grades, and most of them have good test scores, and most of them have done well in undergrad. And so what really helps us differentiate between who's going to be successful in grad school isn't your GPA as much it is the way that you think. And so when I'm looking at a statement of purpose, I'm looking for someone who shows me that they are curious and that they understand what research is all about, and that they understand what a PhD program is going to look like for them. So for the writings for that, I'm sorry, that statement of purpose, it helps to start with a research question. So instead of telling us what is the topic that you want to study, like, it doesn't help us to know that you want to study international politics. It does help us to know that you have a specific research question. So something that you have really wondered about, either that you see in the news or you've experienced in your life, or something that you learned from a class, anything that is something that really like puzzles you and you want to learn more about. So the more you can frame that as a research question, the better. And then tell me how you want to study it. So how is it that you would want to answer that question? Do you want to use statistics? Do you want to go into the field and do interviews? Do you want to do surveys? How is it that you think you want to answer that question? And that helps us to know whether the way that the question that you want to ask and the way you want to answer it is a good fit for our program, right? We are really good in conflict, and we are really good in quantitative methods, but that's not the only way that we study things. And so that we want to know what you want to do and how you want to do it. So I would also try to explain any past research experience that you might have had, and that could look like a whole variety of things. Maybe you worked in a biology lab. That's okay. And maybe you did RA assignment research for a professor. Maybe you did an honors thesis, or maybe you took a writing class that you did some really deep research on, or maybe you interned for somebody over the summer and did research on policy for them. Any of those kinds of things are experiences that help us know how prepared you are to come into a research environment. And there's not one single way that that might look. So there's lots of things that you might consider in laying that out for us. So creativity, a clear question and process for answering, and what is your research experience? Another thing I want to say is that we look at your transcript, and it's less about the GPA and more about what courses you've taken. I think that really help us identify whether you're going to be a good fit. So have you taken courses in social science? We accept people who are not political science majors, but if you've taken some courses in social science, that helps us know that we are getting somebody who can think that way. And also, if you've taken courses that are quantitative of any type, so if you've taken a math course, if you've taken an econ course, if you've taken physics or any other science course that tells me that you know what equations look like and can solve them, those kinds of things are also really helpful. So again, you don't have to take statistics and political science, but if you've taken anything that can tell me that you have some quantitative brain, that's going to help us for our program. Now, if you are applying for graduate programs that are more qualitative, then show that, like show that you've done research in the social sciences, or that you have experience working to collect interviews or surveys, or that you've done some in-depth analysis of interviews or case studies, that kind of a thing. So whatever it is that you are applying for and the way that you want to apply for it, the way you want to do it in graduate school, then having courses that kind of align with that trajectory are helpful. When you are putting together your writing sample, I want to emphasize that your writing sample doesn't have to be long. It does need to show that you asked a question and answered it creatively, and showed that you read the literature, read the scholarship in that topic area, right? So we're more looking for your ability to do research and answer it kind of scientifically than we are about whatever the topic might be, or the length or anything like that. So if you are so if it's from another major, that's okay. If it's telling me that you know how to research and you know how to write it up, that kind of a thing. Or maybe it's a policy briefing that you wrote for somebody, that would work too. Now, other places might have different preferences, but I take a very broad look at what, your ability to show me that you are creative and can think critically and have interest in political science. I think that the last thing I would say is that your letters of recommendation should probably be from professors. If you want to include one from your internship supervisor or somebody that you worked for, that would be okay, but they don't tell us as much as academics can tell us about your skills for graduate school. Like, we want them to tell us not how smart you are, but how able you are to take on PhD level courses in political science. And professors are better at writing those letters than supervisors are. I would ideally like to see one from a political scientist, but that's not required, I think. So yeah, I think that's most of it. If anyone has anything else, please bring it up. But that's the general ideas that I had today.
Thank you, Emily. I wanted to give the other panelists also a chance to jump in on this, and I will start just by adding one thing that I think about as I read all these applications that I think just kind of delves a little bit more into what Emily has said about the question part of the statement, asking a question or letting us know what your research questions are. And that is to try to ask the question the way a social scientist would. And by that, I mean, I'm going to try to give you a little off the cuff example. I had a really wonderful conversation with a prospective student who was interested in disability policy. And she lived in Texas and wanted to understand, why public policy around disability services was not working. So there are a few ways she could ask that question, right? One would be, what explains the trajectory of how we got to this type of policy? Why is disability policy not serving people well? But as a social scientist, I would ask a question like, under what conditions do you have more or less effective policies in this area? And that's a question as a social scientist that you could ask about any kind of area, right? So sort of comparing and contrasting success and failure or different kinds of outcomes is one of the ways that social scientists often structure their research projects. And so sometimes I will read a application that has an interesting topic, but they're approaching it as an anthropologist or a historian might, or even a sociologist. And so to me, they don't seem like a great match for political science. So this is something that that you can think about as you articulate your ideas, but you can also ask your own faculty about, or political scientists that you have any kind of contact with. And let me see if any of the other panelists want to jump in on what makes a strong application for them. Paul.
Yeah, first of all, I would just echo everything that was just said. I think these are all important, absolutely important elements of a successful application. I've seen them both as a DGS that's been chairing a committee and also as a DGS who is simply supervising the chair of the committee. So I've seen it on both sides. One thing that I think is worth bringing up, and I'm actually very curious to hear what my colleagues on this call or on this in this event think about this, is a trend that I've noticed over the past few years, and very much was in the fore this year, is the increasing number of applicants who have a master's degree. That it used to be that probably less than 50% had a master's degree. The past few years, it's now in the order of like 70%, to where essentially it was very rare for someone without a master's degree to actually be offered admissions into our program. And I think that's not to say that it's impossible, but the question becomes, why is that? Well, I don't think it's because the master's degree is some sort of screening device that we're like, oh, okay, you got to have a master's. It's that the master's degree, students with master's degrees tend to have better quality in the other elements that Emily talked about, right? They're better able to craft a statement of purpose. They understand, they have better maybe connections with a faculty member who can write letters of recommendation. They've had this research experience. They've written an MA thesis. They may even be involved in a lab. And we see this actually very much so at the University of Chicago because of our CIR master's programs, where we'll have students who come into the program who weren't successful in getting into PhD programs, but they're very successful after the master's, but it's not, again, because of the master's or the signal or anything, it's because they're now able to produce better quality in the other elements. And so that's something that, again, I've noticed, and I'm curious about what my colleagues in this event have also noticed in that regard.
Emily and Michael. Yes.
I would say that that's true, but I would also, so I would say that's true, that A, there's been an increase in master's applicants, and B, it's not because you have a master's that they're getting in, but because they are writing better statements and writing better writing samples, etc. And just, I want to emphasize that a master's degree is one way to do that, but there are other ways to do that as well. So if you know you wanting to go to graduate school, then sign up for a writing course or an honors thesis or a research lab of any type in the fall, coming up this fall, right? There's also more and more summer programs available, especially for people who are generally underrepresented in the academy, that they can do summer programs to develop their research skills and start a writing sample and meet other professors. So there are what are called the research experiences for undergraduates. You can search REU political science or REU social science and find programs kind of all over the country that will take you, if you are a rising junior, a rising senior, or you have, are about to graduate and want to take a summer to work on this. So there are ways that you can get those experiences and support that are not necessarily a master's degree, especially if that's something that is financially prohibitive for you. So it's worth bearing in mind what Paul said about the reasons that a master's degree is useful. And maybe that's something that you want to do, or maybe there's other ways that you want to get that same experience.
Thanks, Emily. That's excellent advice on the summer programs and on even just working for one faculty member in your university. If you're still in school, you can often do an independent research with faculty and just get your hands dirty with some research. Michael,
sometimes your school will have, sometimes
Yeah.
your school will have money to pay you to do research in the summer for a faculty member. So look for that.
Absolutely. Michael.
Yeah. I just want to kind of echo on this is one way to think about it for the students in the audience, right, is that it is almost like a blind date, right? We don't know you, but we are going to possibly commit hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years to you, right? So, the conversation about masters or all the other things that were said is partly about a way to tell us that you know what you're getting into. You will be satisfied and happy here. You will be fulfilled in our department. And you will do great, right? So when you work on these different components that people have been talking about for your application, think of it as a way to reduce some of the uncertainty that around your file, right? Kind of nobody has a perfect, or, well, I guess Emily was saying there are perfect files, but it's about kind of telling us a bit more, that just to reassure us and tell us, well, there's possibly a home run in this file, but there is, the person knows what he or she is getting into, right? And I think it's perhaps a way, whether you're hesitating for a master's or not, think about it in these terms, right? What do you think will reassure somebody on the committee to say, hey, that person knows what they're getting into and they will do great. And that may also help for decisions about how to spend your summer, doing these research experiences and so forth and so on.
Thank you, Michael. I think this is a good transition point to talk about funding and the way that this works for PhD programs. And Paul has, well, I would say he offered to talk about this, but I did just assign it to him. So Paul, if you would take the lead on describing the basic funding model for most PhDs, which is similar across institutions.
I saw that I was speaking on this. I thought that you must have a window into my DGS life over the past few years, because this has been something, especially at our university, we've been going through big changes with. And so I'm, yes, very well equipped to speak to this issue. Now, there's a very simple answer when it comes to funding for a PhD program, and then there's the more complicated answer. So the very simple answer, and I've heard this many times, I also say this to students, is you do not pay for a PhD. That's the very simple answer. Unless you are funded, you do not go and pursue that PhD. Full stop. So that's it. I'm now done. And we'll move on to the other thing. No, so that's the simple answer, but it is very true and it's very important. And that is something that there could very well be a few people on this call that didn't realize that. They kind of thought about it in the same model as undergrad, where maybe you get a scholarship for part of it or none of it, but you take out a loan to pay for part of it. Same thing with a master's degree. Of course, there can be funded masters, but there can also be very common to pay for at least a portion of your master's. But for a PhD, you do not pay for it. Okay, so that's number one. Now, in addition to not paying for your PhD, you should also be receiving a stipend, because it's one thing to say, hey, we will pay for your PhD, which is, not to get too much into like the intricacies of university budgeting, but it's not so much that they're actually like giving you a scholarship to pay. They're just basically like not charging tuition for it. They're just like, we don't charge tuition for these students. But that's just part of it. So it's one thing to have that, but the other things that you would want is, of course, a stipend, something that you can use to pay for rent, to pay for food, to be able to live on, right? Because you are being paid, we are essentially hiring you to be a student, to become someone who's trained to be a political scientist, to be a social scientist. And so just like with any job, we should be paying you to be able to live, to be able to support yourself, at least to a reasonable level, right? And we can get a little bit into that, what that means. Other components to it, and these should be things that are specified in an offer letter. These are also things that can be indicated on like department's website, is you should have health benefits, right? That's something else too. So just like with any other job, you should have some benefits associated with that. But the other thing is it's not strictly a job, right? Because you're actually a student, which means there should also be the amenities of being a student, right? And having the various services that would be offered to any other student at that university, whether it's health benefits, not just health benefits in terms of medical, but health benefits maybe in terms of counseling services, things of that nature that would be offered to students, rec center access, all those kind of amenities that would also be a student. So those should be the things, like you shouldn't have to be paying for those things. Those should be what you receive as part of your package. So again, very short answer is you should not pay for a PhD. Slightly longer answer is, yes, you should get it tuition free, but you should also have these other things to support yourself, and you should be aware of those things. Now, as was mentioned, I think Thorin mentioned that there can be times where people can be admitted into programs without funding. Most programs don't do that, but there can be some circumstances around where that's done. And so that leads into the more complicated answer, which is, number one, how much are they paying you? there's kind of three questions you want to say, okay, fine, I'm not paying for this, but number one, how much are they paying me? Meaning that stipend, benefits, all that. How long are they paying me? And what are the opportunities to earn money beyond what they're paying me, right? Those are three very important things you want to ask yourself. So the how much are they paying you would be, well, how much is the stipend? How good are these benefits? Those are things you want to look at, just as you would look at with any time you're receiving some sort of offer. You'd want to compare that. Now, it doesn't mean that should be the decisive thing, right? You shouldn't sit there and say, oh, well, this place stipend is 30,000 a year. This other place stipend is 35,000 a year. Therefore, I go with the place 35. It's like, no, you wouldn't want to do that. You want to think back to all the other things that we've already been talking about in terms of the fit of the program, et cetera, as well as factoring in cost of living, all those kind of determinants. So yes, another place might offer you more money, but may not be as good of a fit in the long run for you, which is something else you want to keep in mind. Where in the long run will you be better off? So that's one thing you want to look at, is how much are they paying you in terms of a stipend level. Number two is, how long are they paying you? Is this a stipend for 5 years? Is this a stipend for 6 years, 7 years? That's another question that you want to ask yourself, is for how long is the stipend guaranteed? And moreover, you'd want to find out, well, what would be the opportunities to receive funding once that stipend is over, right? Because most programs will say, we will offer you a stipend of, say, $30,000 a year for 5 years. Okay, that's great, but I'm probably not going to finish in 5 years. I might take a 6th year. What are the opportunities for being able to have that? Does the university offer things called dissertation completion fellowships, right? Am I able to apply for those? Is it expected that I apply for an NSF, National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship? Or is that an expectation that I have something like that? So you'd want to kind of find out what are the opportunities, or what are the expectations regarding if you have to go a year 6 or a year 7. So that's the other thing, is how long are they going to be paying you? And then the third thing is, what are opportunities to earn money outside of that, right? This, depending on the university, can actually be a little tricky. So to just put it right out there, University of Chicago, on the one hand, we have I think a very nice stipend. We also offer this stipend for quite a few years. On the other hand, we have restrictions on how much you can teach beyond the required teaching to be able to earn money. But some other places, people would want to teach extra just to be able to earn extra money. But we actually have restrictions on that. Some other universities might have restrictions on that. Some universities might say, no, you can teach as much as you want. You can be an RA for this lab. You can be a coordinator for a workshop. There can be all sorts of other things that you could do to earn money beyond just the stipend. And of course, the other thing you could do beyond this is, what are internal funding opportunities for like field work and those type of things, which is something that, I feel like we do a pretty good job of having available. Other universities will have available. Sometimes this is something that a department or the college will be able to offer students a certain amount every year to travel to conferences. Or you might be able to acquire a sizable fellowship to help with field work if you need to do field work, say in your 3rd year, 4th year. But those are other things beyond just the standard package that you would want to look into, is opportunities to be able to earn actual income that's still academically related, not going to work at a coffee shop to earn additional income. We would ideally want situations where you can still pursue academic work and make extra income, but also, what are the other funding opportunities available to be able to allow you to do your research? And those are other things to it. And there's so many other elements. I'm sure my colleagues on this call could also speak to that as well. The final thing I will say is, one big caveat to this is that some of you on this call might have opportunities for external funding for your PhD. So this is very common, say, with the armed forces, that we'll have every few years a PhD student coming through from the United States Army, who is an officer. The Army is actually paying for them to come and be admitted to earn a PhD. And in that case, they are what we call an externally funded student. They don't count towards the number of slots that we're allowed to make. So we are able to make them an offer, but that offer would be contingent on their paying their own way. And there's a few other fellowships like that, sometimes offered by governments, But again, probably most common, I think, for a lot of people in the United States, a lot of common one is kind of this military, where you'll have a few officers who will be coming in to receive a PhD. But that would be the one exception that's pretty common when it comes to not paying for the PhD, is that, well, we're not paying for it because they have this guaranteed external source that's paying for it. And therefore their admissions offer is contingent on having that external source. So those are all the elements. Like I said, there's a very simple answer, and then there's all these other things that you want to think about when it comes to the funding and the pay when you're pursuing a PhD.
Thank you, Paul. I really did pick correctly on who to assign this task to. I'm just going to quickly add two more thoughts to that before we, and invite others as well, but before we talk about what you can do with the PhD in political science, which is a fun and exciting topic. One is to say that for many programs with the stipend comes some responsibilities as what we call a graduate assistant. So you would work in my department at Maryland, you work either as a teaching assistant where you grade papers or teach sections of a class, or as a research assistant where you work directly with faculty. There's a few administrative type jobs, but those are the two basic ones. So you take those kind of responsibilities. And then also one question to ask, along with all of Paul's excellent advice, is about the summer support. So many programs offer a yearly stipend, but also can, in some circumstances, offer money in the summer. At University of Maryland, we've now normalized the summer support as part of the offer, but in some departments, this is an open question still. Thorin.
Thanks. One thing on the stipends to keep in mind is the cost of living in the place in which you're admitted. So depending on the size of the stipend, but it may or may not actually be more. So the 30,000 in Chicago would not go as far as, 20,000 probably in, like, I don't know, Champaign, Illinois, or someplace like that, where the cost of living is quite a bit less. So those are things to keep in mind, especially if you're an international student and you're trying to figure out US cost of living adjustments and things like that. That's worth looking into. I noticed that everybody, I think, on this call is basically in an urban area. And so we may not be the best people to speak to this. Like ours is, our cost of living in Phoenix has gone up quite a bit recently in the last couple of years because of the housing market. And that's actually presented quite a few challenges for us in terms of our recruitment. It's come up in ways that it hasn't, and this year in ways that it hasn't in past years. But those things are important to remember. And so if you're looking in California, that's going to be different depending on where you are. If you're going to, like, UC Merced, that's quite a bit less expensive to live in than Berkeley or UCLA. And so those kinds of, or San Diego. And so those are things you want to look up as well. And that's actually something worth asking recruiters and grad directors about. We ended up having we didn't used to have to know this off the top of our head, but this year we really did because of inflation. So that's something that's worth asking about as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Michael.
Yeah, one more thing, and one thing that when I was a student never crossed my mind, and so maybe it's important to bring this up, is that some departments or some universities have some flexibility. For instance, they have some financial resources to help, say, international students fly in when they start their program, right? There is no downside to asking the DGS or whoever you are in contact with about it. It doesn't mean that all departments have the resources. Some are very much restricted and cannot, it's what's on the paper and what the university decides, and that's it. But others may have a bit of resources, and that doesn't hurt, especially early on in your program when you don't necessarily have that much, you're waiting for the first paycheck, or so you should really not feel any guilt or anything about asking that. The worst that can happen is a person says, no, we cannot do this, but it's worth inquiring.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just add one more note on the financials of this. I had an excellent question in the chat about international students, and I think we can talk a little more about this in a few minutes. But I will note that at least at University of Maryland, which is a public institution, there are different restrictions on working than there are for domestic students. And so one of the biggest ones that impacts our students is that most of the domestic students can work extra hours in a research project beyond their base stipend, but international students are not allowed to do that during the semester. So there are some implications for that as well that we can continue to chat about. So our next question I had set out for the panel here is about what you can do with a PhD. So Michael, do you want to lead us on that, please?
Yeah, of course. And it's both the most exciting, but it's also the one that's a bit hard to talk about because the data are a bit sparse here and there. So what I'm going to say is essentially based a bit on my experience as a placement director here. And it's primarily based on some data that the American Political Science Association has collected. But again, the data should always be taken with a grain of salt because it's hard to get exact details about careers on that level. This being said, I think a good rule of thumb is that about 2/3 or so of people who finish with a PhD in political science will stay near academia, by which I mean they will be either working on a tenure track position, or they may become more of a teaching intensive, have a teaching intensive role, or they will go into administration. And in general, it's going to be a mix of the three of these, but it's going to be roughly 2/3, maybe a bit less, will generally continue to live in academia after their PhD. So that leaves about 1/3 to maybe a half that will go outside of academia in non-academic jobs. So, any guys, even if the numbers are, again, they're, take them with a grain of salt, but the most typical outcome remains still that people will work either as a researcher, educator, or an administrator, right? So that depends, despite what we sometimes see in terms of declining numbers of jobs at universities or stagnating jobs in universities, this still remains the primary occupation of people with a PhD in political science. This being said, where we've seen a lot of transformation happen, at least since I started grad school in the early 2000s, late 2000s, is the number of non-academic jobs that are really exciting. I would suspect that historically the most common type of job was in government. Here I can rely on experience in our department. We have placed people in foreign affairs at the State Department or in national security at the Department of Defense for US-based or US citizens. For foreign students, they have often gone in equivalent offices around the world, right? So this has still remained, historically speaking, one of the most typical non-academic jobs that people have taken. The second is the private sector job. And I think that's where things have really changed a lot over the last 10, 15 years. Now, there's always been a sizable number of people who have gone into the private sector job. And this was often perhaps done on the basis of the kind of skills that people acquired at universities. It used to be that many departments had a language requirement skill, right? And so you would have area specialists that would work in, that would bring these competence to the private sector position. But again, over the last 10 years, we have had really a growth in terms of students acquiring more technical skills. Not necessarily quantitative, but also qualitative, that have allowed them to get the interest of jobs across in the technology sector. Many of my former colleagues as PhD students are now working for firms such as Facebook. Others have gone into marketing, political campaigning, and so forth and so on, right? And so these were just kind of, we see a new level of demand that we may not necessarily have seen even 10 years ago. And one thing I would just add here that is not really about the career outcomes that I was asked to talk about, but something when you look at different departments is also asking questions about how proactive they are about helping students find jobs outside academia. Because after 5 years, you may realize that you're not that keen about the academic world, but you still want to do research, right? And I think that's our mission is still to train researchers, but maybe outside of academia. So ask questions about what kind of support there is for non-academic jobs. We do a lot these days of workshops with our career centers, with alumni and so forth and so on. And this is all as a way to kind of think more broadly about this. Anyway, all this to say that, when you think about the kind of jobs that political science can provide, there's going to be about 2/3 of people who do the PhD or finish the PhD will stay in academia in some capacity. And many more will find, many will find jobs in government in the private sector, with again the private sector having been probably the biggest growth area over the last 10 years. And maybe that's something to keep in mind as you think about what you're looking for in a program and what kind of skills you want to acquire during that program, because that could open up a number of opportunities that you may not have thought about before. And lastly, I agree with Kathleen. Every department should have a placement record. This is helpful to think a little bit more about, what a department prepares students for in their careers. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think it's an excellent description of sort of where PhDs are going now in political science, that there are a lot of options available. And I'll say in the area that I live in the DC metro area, it's just the skills you're going to acquire are really in high demand in a lot of different parts of industry in the public sector. I did recently, I'll just share briefly, I did recently have an alumni panel for Maryland students to come back and talk to our current students that were all of these graduates were in what we called the alt academic career path. So none of them were in tenure track positions. All of them had really interesting stories about the ways that their research continued to develop, and a lot of enthusiasm for taking different pathways, and also great advice from them to our current students on how to think about your skill set development in the program. So that's just one example of the type of program that departments might have. As Michael said, ask what they do to help prepare you to have all your options open when you're finishing your degree. So something like that, discussion with alumni, or some more intensive discussion about the different options available. Okay, so I have as our last discussion point here is sort of other advice for applicants. This is what I've asked everyone to talk about. So I want to open it up for other advice, and then as we do this, I'm going to also just throw out 2 points, questions that came up as we can hopefully incorporate these. One is a question from someone who did not get into their preferred program this year, but is thinking maybe to try again. My quick advice is absolutely apply again. Certainly, particularly if you were waitlisted, you have a shot for the next cycle. And then if you have any particular advice or differences in advice for international students, as we think about that. So Thorin can lead us off.
Sure. One thing I wanted so we've gotten a lot of advice about funding and things to ask, and all of those questions are really important. But and cost of living is a major concern because you are doing a 5+ year commitment in all likelihood. But I think a greater concern is not just some raw number of funding over a year, but rather, is this a place I want to spend 5 years plus, and are these the people I want to work with? And I think that fit and the kind of the professional culture of the place, the meeting other students, all of these other things are really important things to take into consideration, because the biggest impediment to, I think, finishing and being successful with a PhD is not can you do the work. Everybody who gets in, we think, has the capacity to do the work. It's the level of commitment at the end part and the dissertation phase, and I think that a place, whichever program you end up in, the kind of mental support, kind of career support that you can get is the sort of intangible stuff. It's not stuff that you can necessarily find out on a website, and it's not necessarily stuff you can find out except through asking people questions during recruitment, I think, to get a sense of it. And that can matter quite a bit. So some programs, so for some students, a big, big intellectually competitive environment may be a really good place for them to do their very best. But for others, a smaller program, and these will vary greatly in size. So our program is maybe, it tops out some years, maybe 30 total PhD students. The one I went to grad school in was about 60, and that was about a medium-sized program. I've heard of some that are over 100. And depending on your learning style, your communication style, these may be different in terms of fit. So those kinds of things, I think, matter as much, if not more, than things like funding and stuff like that. I mean, absolutely, you need funding. There's no doubt about it. You cannot do this without it. But there are going to be programs that don't necessarily have the top end of funding, but are maybe a better fit. And those are things to take into consideration as well.
Thank you, Thorin. Michael.
Yes, just three thoughts based on the conversation we've had today. One is going back to Thorin's earlier point about the fit. Very practical thing, but when you look at the department, try to find at least 3 people, say, who are in your areas, because people retire, people move, people have career changes, and you want just to have a bit of a buffer, if I may say, there. The second is for those of the students in the room who have struggled, say, in the last cycle. I don't know if this was shared by my colleagues here, but I think because of the freeze that many departments had last year, I think we had a bump in terms of numbers and the competitiveness of applicants, which meant that last year was extremely competitive, and I have no doubt that extremely high, very good students did not get the outcome that they were hoping for. And I would imagine that might iron itself a little bit out, but I don't know. And then the last point is, I think Kathleen mentioned a question about international students, and I think I'm the only international admissions person here. So, again, going back to the earlier theme is find ways to reduce uncertainty if you come from a place that is not necessarily well known or well connected to, say, US academia, if you're planning to apply to the US, right? And one way to do so is perhaps to rely on alumni who have done their undergrad degree or master's degree or even PhDs at your home institution and are now in the US. I know that if I were to receive emails from my not so well-known undergrad institution, I would be more than happy to help to navigate the system and help in any way or shape. This would be another way to try to address that challenge.
Thank you. Emily.
I wanted to add to what Dr. Wright said that about what is a good place for you. And I want to emphasize that people learn in different ways. Some people learn under fire and prefer a very intense and competitive environment. Other people really don't. And that's something that you aren't probably going to be able to tell from websites, but it's all the more reason to apply to multiple places in the way that Dr. Wright suggested, because that way, if you get into a couple, you can decide among them. Because in my experience, graduate school is hard. PhD studies are hard, but they can also be kind, and not every place is like that. And so it's worth getting to know a place that once you get in and have some options in front of you. And I also want to agree with my colleagues that you should absolutely apply again. My advice would be to think about the kinds of things that we've talked about as successful applications and look to see, are you asking a research question? Are you explaining your research experience? And it wouldn't hurt, even if you've been out of undergrad for a while, you could reach out to somebody who was your letter writer and say, hey, would you look this over? Does this look like I'm presenting myself in a research-centered light? How do you think I could better tell my own story, that kind of thing, so that you can apply again? And I mean, we admitted someone this year who had applied the year prior and didn't get in. That it happens all the time. So I definitely recommend reapplying, but take the time that you've had to update your application and make it even stronger.
Thank you, Emily. I've got Paul and Thorin.
Yeah, just to build on the idea of reapplying and also to expand that out to how many places should you apply. One thing I always say to students is you need to ask yourself, what is your risk tolerance and what is your budget constraint, right? And those two things intersect. And what I mean by risk tolerance is, are you in a situation where you have to get into a PhD program the following year, maybe for a variety of reasons? If that's the case, then you're going to want to apply more broadly, right, to even more programs. Again, maybe not at the level of how many places you applied to as undergrad, though it kind of depends. I didn't apply to that many places when I was undergrad. I applied to more places for my PhD. But that's one thing you need to ask yourself is, what's your risk tolerance? Now, if you're in a situation where you're like, you know what, if I don't get into a place next year, I kind of like what I'm doing, I've got other things, then you don't need to apply as many places. But then this also runs up against your budget constraint, right? So if you are in a situation where you're like, I have to get into a PhD program next year, but even if you're able to get the fees waived, there's still costs, right? If we think about this economically, there's opportunity costs, there's the preparation, you want to tailor the statement of purpose to each of the programs, getting the faculty. Do you want to send 40 of those type of applications out? Probably not. So that's something else that should factor into where you apply. But on that note of risk tolerance, one thing that I always, and for some students, this is like a revelation to them, but I tell them that, like, look, I waited 5 years before I went to a PhD program. Like, I think some people think, oh, you go straight from undergrad to master's to the PhD, and that's what you do, and it's a linear path. And it's like, no, it can actually be, you can go do something else for a while and then come back. So that's something else. And by doing that other thing might actually put you in a better spot to be more competitive the next time. So I think that's another thing to factor into that risk tolerance, is be like, you know what, it would be okay if I went and worked for this research firm for 5 years. I mean, that would be great. And that would actually better position me for this. So I just wanted to make sure that that point was out there, because I'm sure that's something that folks on this call are trying to consider.
Yeah, thank you. Thorin.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that Paul just said. And just as an aside on the reapplication thing, we also did admit someone this year who had applied last year, and very happy that they're coming. But I also, from my own experience, I got a master's at my undergrad, and one of my classmates applied to a PhD program and did not get in that first cycle, did get in the next cycle, and is a bona fide superstar in the field. So it does happen. And so that it's not an indicator of success or anything like that. We just, year to year, the cohort fit may just dictate that the cohort is small that year, or or it leans one way or another. And it's certainly, admissions are just not a perfect system at all.
Yeah. Just a quick note on the fit issue. I think this is one thing that's very challenging to see from the outside, is that as we read applications, we think about your research interests and the research interest of the current faculty and how many students they are already supervising. So you may be an excellent fit for a person that ended up with 5 students over the last 3 years. And so that has dictated the response to your application. So that is in part to say, I would not take a rejection, especially a waitlisting, as a negative reflection on your abilities or assessment of them. I want to just, since we're at time here, take a minute to thank all of our panelists. This is absolutely wonderful.